Isaiah 63 talks about their absolute desperation, how badly they needed God, how badly they needed His power at work, which sounds a lot like our lives today. And then it asks a question in verse 12, and it says, "Where is the one whose power was displayed when Moses raised his right arm?" It's talking about how Moses stood in front of the entire nation, held that staff up with his right arm, and the Red Sea parted for them to walk across on dry land. What an amazing man of God that he, by faith, could do something that amazing. But Moses didn't start out that way. This series is building your faith, and we're exploring what it takes to have that greater faith. And the story of Moses is one that absolutely demonstrates our need for it to be God's power at work, not ours, and a fundamental principle of how we gain greater faith. Now, we'll see in a moment what I mean, but again, Isaiah 63:12, which to me is so compelling. Where's the one? They're calling for God's power. They're calling out their need for God to move. And they say, where's the one whose power was displayed when Moses raised his strong right arm? That Moses would be such a man of faith, such a friend of God, that he would stand in front of the entire nation and lift his arm with that staff, and the Red Sea parted again, and they walked across on dry land. And God used him to do amazing things. God used him, that he was the instrument, that literally he was the one that brought God's miraculous power that caused the Egyptians not just to free his people, but to push them out, literally to drive them out towards what God had for them. He's the one that when there was no water, that God's power through his faith responded and water was provided for the people. Their needs were met. And as we'll see, he was so transformed that he was even able to intercede on their behalf with God when they were clearly wrong, because he had caught the heart of God. All of this took an unbelievable degree of faith. See, faith is the key that unlocks all of God's blessings, all of his promises. It's the only way it works. And as we'll see, he didn't start out that way. Now, we're not talking about the baby in the basket in Pharaoh's house, but what we see is in Exodus, there came the day when he saw the oppression of God's people. And so he took matters into his own hands. Now, what do we always say? Helping God out never works out. So what does Moses do? Now, this is a story that people struggle with, but it's actually not that difficult. So Moses kills the Egyptian, and he hides the body. And he thinks nobody has seen. Now later, a couple of Israelites, God's people, are arguing, and Moses tries to break it up. And they literally say, "Are you going to kill us too, like you did with that Egyptian?" And that begins the story of Moses running off into the wilderness and living there for years. Now we'll come back to that story. But why is this so important? And it's a lesson for us. See, the story of Moses is the story of you and I. Why? Because what happens? Now, Acts tells us he thought they would understand that God was going to use him to free them. See, how he got it, I don't know. We don't know. But Moses knew that he was to be God's instrument to free his people. That was his destiny. Now, Christians stumble over that word destiny. I'm okay with that one way or the other, but recognize Psalms 139 says that God created the days for you and I before there were any. So God has a calling, a destiny, if you want to call it that. He has a calling on my life and on your life. But the reality is, when we try to fulfill it in our strength, I mean, come on, Moses, talk about a puny effort. What, are you going to take on the Egyptians one at a time? No, but that's how misled we are when we're moving in our strength and how puny our efforts are. As elaborate as our plan is, how strategic as it may seem, even if it is God's purpose, when it's not God working through us, it is puny. And so what happens? That is a failure. And so Moses runs off and he spends 40 years in the wilderness. But see, God isn't done with him. And it's a great message for you and I. Why? We're going to make our mistakes. We're going to blow it from time to time. But God isn't done. As long as we don't give up, God isn't done with us. Now, God reinitiates relationship with Moses at the burning bush. And God introduces himself to Moses. See, they are beginning the process of a deeper relationship. And that's a relationship that's spending time in God's presence would ultimately, absolutely transform not just everything Moses did, but it would absolutely transform him. And we'll see it's a lesson for you and I. It isn't enough for us to go through life, and I'm as bad as anybody. It's our natural response is to work things out in our strength. But how desperately we need, and how desperately I want more of God at work. I want what God can accomplish much more than I want what I can accomplish. And so, after hesitation, Moses responds, and he begins this process of going before and acting as God's instrument. And so in doing so, what happens? Yes, we see these miracles. I mean, imagine how much faith it took to stand in front of all the people. How much faith did it take to declare to Pharaoh, all these things are going to happen? But as he spent time in God's presence, he was transformed. And fundamentally, faith was one of the most important aspects. And we see that continue through his life. In fact, what happens? We see the story is, and it becomes a great example for Joshua. What would happen? Moses would go to the tent of meeting, and God would meet with him face to face. He absolutely spent time in God's presence. It wasn't enough for him to just fulfill God's instructions, but he not only spent time in God's presence face to face, but we see that he's transformed. And he's transformed not only in what he's asking for, how he will be bold in front of God, asking for forgiveness for God's people, but we see that what? There's a physical transformation. See, when we spend time in God's presence, we are changed. And what? His face glowed from being in God's presence. But more importantly, what do we see? We see his desires are transformed. He desires more of God. In fact, what does he say? He asks God. Now he meets with God, but he's saying, show me your face. He wanted more of God. And that was the defining attribute of their relationship. Moses wanted more of God. Now, was he perfect? Did he make his mistakes? Yeah, just like you and I. But he wanted more of God. And in doing so, he was transformed. God's power was released. That those puny efforts he made in his strength were overlooked because God's power was released. People's lives were transformed. God's power did the miraculous. And it all came out of this time they spent together. And more importantly, it set an example for Joshua. And Joshua then followed in his footsteps, and he not just would go in with Moses into the tent of meeting, but he stayed there. And in doing so, Joshua became one of the mightiest warriors, the mightiest leaders that ever lived, that he followed on in Moses' footsteps. And he led God's people into conquering the promised land. Every army they fought was greater and stronger than they were. And it all came from following Moses' example. So why is this important for you and I? Well, God has a call on your life. He has a call on my life. We'll call it a destiny if you want. But the other side is, anything we attempt in our strength, anything we do for God, even in following his instructions, if his power and his presence isn't going with us, it's puny, it's pathetic, it's embarrassing actually. But God's power has the ability to absolutely transform what we do. And how do we receive that? How do we tap into that? Well, the biggest thing is just spending time. The most important thing, the most fundamental thing is spending time in his presence. Now, I get it. So often we try to get in God's presence and immediately our mind is wandering to stuff we don't even care about. But here's the thing. Just make the effort. Just take the time. See, the Word says that when we draw near to Him, He will draw near to us. In the fundamental, the most important aspect of seeing our lives transform, seeing our lives become impactful, is that time in His presence. Let's make that effort. We can look at a great story and recognize truth in it, but unless we respond to it, unless we take shack, how we respond impacts how we progress. So for all of us, let's take that time to actually make that effort to get into God's presence, whatever it takes, that we would continually be seeking to be in His presence and watch Him transform that experience, watch Him transform us, watch Him transform people around us. Because it's all by faith that we are able to not just access His presence, but access all of His blessings.